Welcome, everyone, back to the podcast. I'm your host, Phil, and I'm joined by Brian Brushwood. We're going to be talking about storytelling and other forms of learning from what I would classify as a seasoned, if not master educator. And the reason I believe that to be the case is that this is someone I followed for many, many years. In fact, going back and watching the videos and noticing that they said 16 years ago or 18 years ago. So probably you experienced like ages yourself a little bit. It aged myself as a viewer also to be like, okay, that was a long time ago that maybe I was first interacting with some of these videos.
Yeah, no, and I remember feeling like I was too late to YouTube because it was 2006 and it had come out in 2005.
But I'm just going to play just the intro segment of this because I think this will give nostalgia moments for people listening of like, oh, man, this is how I know that name. But also it may tee you up to like, this is the premise of why I believe you're a master educator. But we're just going to play this. You referenced that the sponsor was Netflix. I'm glad that nothing has happened to them. They have gone nowhere since then.
Yeah, I think they do something other than mail DVDs, though.
But the core principle was something that I wrote down was that this idea of social engineering. This was the kind of like for me watching, it was beyond when we were watching Scam School learning magic tricks. And I think that that was my initial Google, if I was trying, was partly because I was an outdoor educator at the time. I just moved to the US and I was trying to find moments to entertain or elevate the experience of education that I was giving to my students in down moments. So I taught myself magic tricks. So that's kind of like, that was my initial. I kind of wrote down here as well, and we can get to this in a moment, but you'd referenced in a previous conversation about begin with a gift in storytelling. And I kind of used magic in that way to kind of bring in, engage people, draw people in, and then teach them after the fact. And so I interacted with Scam School, but I think what kept me coming back to it was not the magic trick, because you could Google and find other people who were teaching card tricks. It was that social engineering element to it. From your experience of so many of those episodes and so many opportunities to educate and teach, what would you describe as the most effective learning environment? What elements of learning did you find that were the most effective?
So, in the second episode of World's Greatest Con, we talk about how a good scam or con begins with a tableau, a situation where the mark, the sucker, or in the case of a YouTube video, the viewer, the listener, or the student, it's their job to draw assumptions and to build out their mental model of the world around it. In the case of video games, the main character is the player, the protagonist. They don't know their name. They don't know their lines. They don't know where to go. They don't even know how the world works, but they have to design the world in such a way where it reveals itself through a story. So you think about a bad game begins with instructions and tutorials and up, down, left, right, all of that stuff. Instead, a better game, you start by fading from black and it says, on your feet, maggot, get over to training. And then if you just start mashing buttons, or maybe it gently cues you to hit when then you encounter something that is blocking you. It's like, you better get there. You got 10 seconds. Then you learn to crouch and get across. And now in the process of essentially going through a hero's journey, you go from a place of comfort until you want something. And so you go through a series of very minor trials, but then you end up at the destination, a changed person, in that you now know how to jump, walk, forward, back, strafe left, strafe right, look around, and draw your weapon. Now, we didn't say that those were the objectives of this segment. That was the revealed aspect to it. Likewise, you'll notice that I went years on Scam School without ever admitting that I was teaching magic. What the show should have been called is Beginner Lessons in Magic with Brian. Instead, I set a tableau of explaining immediately, you have a terrible problem. When you go to the bar, you buy your own drinks. You don't drink for free. How are we going to fix it and make you the most interesting person in the room? And of course, week after week, the answer just happened to be yet another magic trick. Although over time, as I'm sure you noticed, there are different types of tricks. There are tricks that are openers that require very little on the part of the audience. You're not asking them to pick a card. That's too big of an ask right out of the gates. Instead, you want to do something that's a flashy visual, something that makes people all on their own say, whoa, do that again. I mean, of course, you don't repeat a trick. Once is a trick, twice is a lesson. Instead, you do the old salesman trick of answering a question with a question. Oh, did you like that? What are they going to say? No. They'll say yes. And it's like, would you like to see another? Again, yes, of course. Now you have explicit permission to do another trick. And every lap in this circle, as I put it, the story, attention, sales cycle, you have something. You have your story. You begin with a gift, something that is not a sample of it, but a gift freely given that earns you a bit of real estate in other people's minds. That is it. That attention is pregnant. It's leverage that allows you to harvest it first in the form of, can I do another trick for you? Yeah, I'll sit through another one of these. That's you reinvesting to make the story bigger. Now the story isn't just one trick, it's two tricks. It's a series of tricks. And something very curious happens around the 20-minute mark. Around the 20-minute mark, people begin to pick up on the fact that they've had a really good time. They've received a performance that is of value. And Cornell University's Dennis Regan experiments shows that people desperately want to reciprocate once they've received something of value. So by the time you get to that classic bar scam gotcha, whether it's a trivia question or an unbeatable puzzle, yeah, on the surface, it's a gotcha, you got to buy me a drink. But what it really is beneath the surface, which must never be spoken, is it's a face saving opportunity for the student, the spectator, to balance the scales and buy you a drink and give you something of value in exchange for your time.
It's interesting that what we're attempting to do as educators and the work of a magician or an entertainer are incredibly overlapped. If you go back to educators that have influenced you over the years, a mentor, someone who you have been drawn in by. Typically, we might frame the word charisma as like, oh, they're just charismatic. But they have tools, they have systems, they have things that they have done to be able to draw in the attention. And that's a role that I think educators and anyone really who are front facing working with human beings should be considering. What are the tools, what are the systems that we could leverage to better draw in and find that real estate time, right?
Yeah, now that I've done a few laps around the sun, it's been nearly 20 years since I had the idea for Scam School. And the one thing I knew in the beginning was that most magic explanations were always, here's a trick, here's the answer, the end. And because of the format, we had the opportunity to actually be in the bar. And it was important to me to sift out the fake garbage tricks where whoever's selling you this book wants to say, oh, yeah, no, you'll drink for free forever and ever. I was like, yeah, but there's only one way to find out is to try it and to actually see what falls flat. And there's no substitute for action. And so one of the things that I've noticed at this point is that the structure of a scam or a con is identical to the structure of a magic trick, is identical to the structure of a good sales pitch, is identical to the structure of the art of seduction, is identical to the structure of a good educator. Now, the only question is, where do you want to lead people? Where do you want people to figure out to have their epiphany all on their own? And when you see those structures, you begin to notice that, first of all, you can't push anybody into enlightenment. All you could do is make the most obvious answer the next one. You have to design this video game level so that they experience it bit by bit. And of course, you have to be able to adjust on the fly. There might be a trick where, let's say the method involves have the cards be red, black, red, black, red, black, right? And that's the whole method for the trick. And then there's that extra beat in a Scam School episode where instead of doing, here's a trick, here's how it's done, there's that, what I call the C block. That's where I hand them the cards and I say, now you go. And now, meanwhile, these people, maybe in another life, they're a neurosurgeon with precise, delicate hands, but all of a sudden they realize they don't have the kinesthetic knowledge of how to manipulate a deck of cards. They've never thought about how to present them. And so they clumsily spread them in an awful way. And you're like, oh, so you don't even know how to spread the cards. Okay, look, we're going to hold it like this. We're going to spread them like a conveyor belt so you can see all those indexes and everybody can know exactly which card they're picking. These are things that there is no way to know whether or not that's the lesson they need to figure out until after they find themselves trying it. And of course, intuitively, this is obvious. Kids don't learn by being told things, they learn by exploring the world. And because they don't know how to experience guilt or shame, they throw together strings of words in nonsense ways. They repeat things, they experiment, and then they deal with the data as they see it. And what I've noticed is that an awful lot of institutional education, and I don't just mean public education or even universities, I mean, your security awareness training, there, anything that is done at scale on paper, yeah, it does seem like it would work to have somebody watch a video explaining how phishing scams work and then maybe take a quiz to prove they know it. But that's equivalent of me showing a trick and then telling you how it's done. I want to see that C block, that experience where we hand them the deck of cards and say, now that you know what a good phishing email looks like, you're going to write them. You're going to actually try to trick your friends into clicking on a link. Rickrolling has done more for security awareness training than any amount of classes.
It's interesting that you kind of referenced the experience part, partly because, I work in the experiential education and that is the core at what we try to teach. What you've done in unintentionally or intentionally, maybe early on in scam school, was you put people into a role where they had to experience things. I actually remember vividly watching some of the videos and seeing the recoil when the people who were being quote unquote shown a trick then were asked to perform it, and they performed it for you, and then you gave them subtle guidance. And that's where I think like the educator part is probably undervalued from what you were able to achieve in the work you're able to achieve. And you have this now history of educational knowledge of like what has worked, because you've got to the point where you've got good at crafting an experience and then allowing them to reflect on that experience and help them get better. And I think that that's the miss, going back to what you're saying about even the holding of the cards, going back to that basic part. Would you say that the experience gap, maybe the lack of experience, is maybe the miss between someone who has technical skill and then actually performs successfully?
I think it is a critical gap that is truly a binary. For example, if you take your eighth grade kid and send him off to magic camp, if he were to come home and you were to say, well, what tricks did you learn? And then he were to tell you about so and so's illusion, and he knows how it's done, and this illusion, and he knows how it's done. And you're like, yeah, but I sent you to magic camp. Can you do any tricks? Who did you fool? Oh, nobody. We never did any of that. Well, then you didn't learn magic. You learned about magic. And I don't want my kid learning about science. I want my kid learning science. And more importantly, now that we're in an age where what I'm calling an AI scam apocalypse is happening, a recent Deloitte study says that we are on track for $80 billion of deepfake AI assisted fraud in just 2 years. And when staring in the face of real losses, I don't want people learning about phishing scams or real-time deepfakes on Zoom. I want people to have a tournament to see how many people they were able to fool into making them believe they were the CEO. Now you're going to automatically smell it coming from a mile away. There was one time in my entire life that I ever caught a scam in progress. It was when I was 18 years old working at a movie theater. I had just started magic. I was maybe 2 months in, and I had never heard of the short change scam. This is where somebody comes in, gets change for a 20 or a 50, a bunch of bills come and go, and somehow they walk away with more of the register's money than they're entitled to. But the very nature of it, the lyrical process of oh, let me get change for a 20. Well, that's two fives, right? So that must be for this 10, and that must be, and therefore we agree. And even just 2 months into magic, I recognized the lyrical pacing. I said, this is a magic trick. And sure enough, they took us for $50. It wasn't for years later that I would read Gavin DeBecker's book, where he talks about the distinction between what Daniel Kahneman calls system two and system one thinking. System two is your high calorie cognitive thinking, and then your system one is your gut level. And most psychologists love to talk about how system one is easy to trick with word puzzles. And that's fine. But Gavin DeBecker, the security consultant, he points out that humans don't have fangs or claws or scales or rough skin. We have one thing: the world's most finely honed sense of intuition, the world's best system one defense that is always on, looking for that moment when we find ourselves saying, that's weird. And the only way to build that up is through experience. You have to do the reps. And that means I, of course, don't start with the headline, hey, I'm going to do a magic trick, and then I'm going to force you with the cameras rolling to suddenly adopt the role of deceiver. But instead, we nudge our way there, and two things happen. Number one, it proves to all the magicians out there who want to claim that what I did was exposure and not teaching, the difference between exposure and teaching is one thing. When the lesson is over, can they do the trick? If they can do the trick, then clearly they were just taught. And it was not just scratching that itch of exposure. And meanwhile, everybody at home, their mirror neurons are firing like crazy because they're watching their surrogate protagonists, their themselves. Oh my goodness, that could be me. How would I do it? And they're going to watch them make the exact same mistakes they would have made at home. And so the lesson's going to deepen. Even though they're not actually there, they're virtually experiencing it thanks to those mirror neurons.
And that's where, like, I think as well, empathy kind of ties into the ability for me to watch someone struggle is actually of more value to me than watching a professional show off. But it's a demonstration of skill that I don't currently have. And that gap between someone who's really skilled and someone who's novice, the gaps can sometimes be too big. And so there's a disconnect between this person and this person at the start. So seeing someone struggle actually for me was really helpful too, because that allowed me to practice and say, well, I think the technical part, but the patter, that's the part that is the important part that I now need to distinguish that will take me to that next level. You've kind of crafted or at least focused a little bit onto this idea of storytelling, that at the core of what you're doing is you're crafting a story that's engaging people and that you then can get further leverage in. What was that point for you if we go back to the Brian Brushwood story? When was that point of you realizing that that was actually maybe your superpower in what you were doing beyond the spiky haired eating fire Brian Brushwood maybe of 20 years prior?
Sure. Well, for anybody who's listening to just the audio, behind me over my shoulder, you'll see three trophies. Before YouTube, it was difficult to know whether or not you had the goods in magic. The only way was to enter magic competitions, and they were taken very seriously. There'd be judges. You wouldn't know who the judges were. You would just perform for the audience, and then you'd be ranked, and it was a difficult tournament. But I had won a couple of statewide trophies, and so I knew I had a good magic show. But I also knew that everybody I respected in magic, your Pettit Tellers, your Amazing Jonathan, your Harry Anderson, all of them had done street performing. And I realized, well, then I'll just head down to Austin's world famous 6th Street. I'll find this little corner where technically I'm only trespassing, not performing in a public space, and I'll start. Now, if I was a musician, I could just start playing my bass or whatever, and then hope somebody threw a dollar into a hat. But I was a magician, and I couldn't even begin until somebody picked a card. And of course, not knowing how to gather a crowd, I tried to do my best P.T. Barnum. I knew I had the goods. Hey, everybody gather around. I'm going to eat fire. I'm going to break a 30-pound brick over my head. I'm going to stick a nail in one eye, pop it out the other eye. And then something very weird happened. The more of this I did, the more shouting I did, the bigger a bubble of avoidance happened around me. Because to all of those eyeballs coming and going, the performance was already happening. And the story was a crazy person wants you to pick a card. Now, meanwhile, I'm in Austin, Texas, but off in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the magician David Groves, the guy who wrote Be a Street Magician, he wrote the book on street performing. He, as far as I know, had 0 Texas-based magic trophies. So at my 19-year-old brain, I was able to hypothesize that he had a less good show, and yet he never had trouble building a crowd, and he never had trouble making money. How could he do that with an inferior product? Well, the answer was he had something I didn't. He had a bunny rabbit in a top hat on the table. That's it. He didn't say nothing about what he was going to do. He just sat there futzing with his cards, sitting behind this desk because he knew that that bunny in a hat, that bunny on the table was a self-contained unit of story. Now, it's not a very complicated story. If anybody was walking by, it would be simply 3 seconds of your eyeballs landing on the bunny saying, that is a cute bunny. And off you would go with your day. But he knew that the crowd dynamics aren't Newtonian, they're stochastic. And he knew 100 people, 200 people, by 300 people going by, it was statistically impossible that somebody wouldn't self-select, walk over, and fall into his trap. Eventually, they would walk over and say, excuse me, can I pet the bunny? Of course, he'd say. And only after they pet the bunny did he say, but you know the rule. You pet a bunny, you got to pick a card. What are you going to say? No? But just like that, he's got one. And one's all he needs because now, while my story at this point was I was shouting about the 75th thing I was gonna do. By this point, he now has a vignette, a tableau, just like a good scam artist. He's got a magician, a little girl, a bunny, a hat, a deck of cards. That is a story in progress. And now it's so magnetic, so hypnotic that a pair of eyeballs lingers a little bit too long. And he's able to lock eyes and say, excuse me, sir, she just picked a card. Will you make sure she remembers it? I got to look the other way. He turns his back. What is the guy just going to walk on past? No, he's now part of it. And one by one, he makes little harvests. After these gifts, after he earns that attention, he says things like, oh, excuse me, we're blocking the sidewalk. Can I get everybody to take 2 big steps in? And now the picture changes. Now this is a show in progress, a gravity well performing 1 trick, 2 tricks, 3 tricks, 5 tricks. And finally, we hit that 20-minute mark. And what happens? People begin to get uncomfortable. They begin to sense they've received something of value. And then by the end of that performance, he passes around that exact same top hat that held the bunny. Only now, by the time the performance is over, it's filled with $150. The crowd evaporates and he goes on to the next performance.
How do we extrapolate that lesson into maybe actionable steps for someone who is engaging? Maybe the message isn't you need to have a rabbit with a top hat, but what are the key elements to what that is that I think would be essential for someone to take note of?
Yeah, the key element, I don't know, I'm drawing, I don't know if you're able to see the video.
Yeah, I can see
Is
that, yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm just drawing 3 circles, an S, an A, and a dollar sign. Those are story, attention, and sales. Story is what you got. Now, if you're a plumbing company, it's a great plumbing service. If you're a script writer, it's your great scripts. If it's a podcaster, it's a great podcast. But of course, what you want is more of it. And then attention is real estate in other people's minds. Now, we know what 0 views looks like. We know what 1 million views looks like, but that doesn't really reveal the depth of the relationship that you have. And of course, the more laps you take, the deeper the relationship. Sales, that's easy enough to track. It's either dollars or action. But here's the important part is this circle that I just drew only goes one way. It's if you go clockwise, if you start with story, begin with a gift, that bunny on the table, and then earn the attention, and then harvest that attention, and then use that to reinvest it to tell a bigger story. Every lap around this the story gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Everybody wins. When you try to go backwards on the circle, it's a vicious cycle and everything gets smaller and smaller. And you see this because strangely, whatever you're wealthy in of the 3 currencies, people want to go backwards on the circle. For example, let's say you had a Hollywood script that you knew could be $1 billion franchise, 3 movies, $1.5 billion at least. You'd probably want to get paid for that script. So you would do the dumbest thing possible. You would try to go backwards on the circle and exchange your story for money. You'd go out, meet with 1,000 producers, do 100 lunches, get 10 option deals. One of them would follow through. If you're very lucky, that movie would be profitable. There'd be a sequel and another one after that. I'm not going to say it never happens, but I wouldn't bet on it. But meanwhile, the right way is as counterintuitive as it is to give it away for free. Because Erica Mitchell liked Twilight a lot. The vampire story, the werewolf. She liked it so much now she legally couldn't write fan fiction and sell it for money. So instead, she wrote saucy erotic fan fiction of the vampire, the werewolf, and the girl. And so she gave it away for free at fanfiction.net, where it earned a lot of attention. So much attention, fanfiction.net says, please remove your filthy smut from our site. And wealthy in 2 currencies, she made her first harvest. It wasn't for money, it was for action. She said to the fan community, please follow my adventures at its new site, 50shades.com. At which point she had all three currencies. She had her fan base that she had instant access to. She said, hang on, I'm going to change all the characters to an IP that I own. The werewolf becomes a photographer, the vampire becomes a billionaire, and it grows and grows and grows. And then finally the ebooks get released. Everybody buys the ebooks. Then the ebooks become physical copies. Everybody buys those. And contrary to popular opinion, Hollywood doesn't love opportunity or possibility. They love momentum. And so 50 Shades becomes a $1.5 billion franchise. Same thing happens if you imagine becoming a millionaire of attention overnight. That's exactly what happened to Kevin Federline. I don't know if everybody remembers Kevin Federline, but there was a day around 2006 that nobody knew his name. And then the whole world knew the name Kevin Federline because he was the guy that married his childhood sweetheart, Britney Spears. Now, unfortunately, everybody was booking him up for interviews. All they wanted to ask was, what's it like to be Mr. Britney Spears? That's not what he wanted to be famous for. He had his own story. So he wanted to be famous for something other than what he was famous for. So he tried to go backwards on the circle. He immediately released a rap album and guested on the WWE. He was booed out of the auditorium and his rap album was panned. If you look at his Google Trends, you'll see a spike and then everything will go down to nothing. Now, meanwhile, that exact same year, somebody else got famous. In the great list of things to become famous for, marrying your childhood sweetheart is not a bad one. But imagine you became famous for something you did not want to be famous for. That's exactly what happened to Kim Kardashian. Kim Kardashian had a sex tape leaked, and she did not go backwards on the circle. She did not want to be respected for her mind. She instead went forwards on the circle, first filing an injunction against Vivid Video, 2 months later, cutting a deal, using that momentum, excitement, and leverage to get an E-entertainment television show, Keeping Up with the Kardashians. And while that show has never been regarded as high art, it's never won an Emmy, but it does have multiple college courses taught on its cultural impact. And now she's used all that fame and wealth to leverage changing her story into now practicing law where she donates her time pro bono to free unjustly imprisoned individuals. And then finally, let's say you got a small business, you got $1 million a year HVAC company. You probably don't care about story at all. Why on earth would story matter? However, all you want is more business. You want the currency of attention. You go out and buy a billboard. You spend $10,000 a month on this giant billboard, and you make sure your name and your website is as big as possible on there. Congrats. 100,000 cars go past it every day, but not one of them cares more than you as you go to sleep, right? Now, meanwhile, let's say you take that same $10,000 a month. That's exactly what the HVAC company here in Austin did, Radiant Plumbing, because they realized they didn't have any billboards. What they had was 200 service vehicles, white box vans. But as the storytellers thought of it, real estate. So they took all of those vans, they gave him a unique color scheme, purple and gold, and they made them into one-note comic strips. Somebody's proposing to someone with a plunger. Somebody's catching a toilet as a touchdown. All of these are little gifts freely given. Now, keep in mind, they're not in the comedy business. A bunny on the table is not a free sample of it. The guy in the story with the bunny on the table, he's not running a petting zoo and a haberdashery. He's giving away an adjacent self-contained gift that is congruent with the rest of the story that he really wants to tell, which is he's got a rad magic show. So likewise, by being self-deprecating and giving the gift of comedy, they earn position in the mind. They earn that real estate. And later, ended up being on Last Week with John Oliver multiple times, getting millions of dollars of free publicity and eventually selling the company to private equity and making a gazillion dollars. That's what it looks like to go forwards on the circle.
There is a human element of care. Like, I care enough to have given you this, and therefore they have a care towards you to spend more attention, right? Like, it's not a selfless act. There's a two-way street between the give and the give, right? Like, I'm going to give you something and you're going to give me something in return. Is that accurate?
That's Roy Williams is the founder of Wizard Academy, a business school that, as I like to put it, they teach entrepreneurs to be a little bit poetic and they teach poets to make a little bit of money. He talks about the need to differentiate between the transactional and the relational. When you deal with a transactional relationship, when money enters the equation, very quickly you know when you're square and you could drop everything, which is why what you want to do instead is build a relationship with the customer so that you're front of mind. If you think about it, all of insurance is an efficient market. The actuarial tables are the same across the board. So when the insurance companies compete, they compete in this tournament of gift giving sketches. You could sit in any sports bar and glance over and see one flavor of a comedy skit, another flavor of a comedy skit, another one. What they are doing is they're all trying to give you enough gifts that you're like, ooh, this is a Geico flavored ad. Ooh, this is a State Farm flavored ad. Ooh, this is the one where the guy gets beat up. Because of that, when you have to make that tedious decision, eventually, all things being equal, you're going to go with the one that you kind of owe it to them.
There's a phrase that we have in experiential ed, or at least a lot of educators that I interact with use, called connection before content, which is before you deliver content, you need to connect. And I think that that is a through line between what we've been discussing, which is we're making a connection initially before we start giving them content. And if you just give content, if you just try to give like, this is something you should know, then people are less likely to receive it than say, let's connect with what you want, what you need, what you desire, where's the outcome going, whatever that might be. And that can draw people in to then to listen to the content of what you're sharing.
There's a number of tactics or techniques that, if they were used in a scam or a con or a pickup artist situation, would seem skeezy, but if they are used openly, are, to my mind, effective communication skills. One of them is here in Austin is an incredible speaker named Sam Horn, and what she will do, she's fully institutionalized this. Before she goes on any digressions, she gets permission. So let's say you made a point about, I don't know, a whooping cough or whatever. And she'll say, oh, if I may, 30 seconds on how you can stop that. And then you are offered the chance to say yes. But the real purpose of that is not so much to explicitly ask permission, but what she's done is already calmed you down and gotten you in the headspace of being open to her message, because you know whether you believe it, don't believe it, whether you've heard it before, whatever it is, it's only 30 seconds away from being over with. So that subtext, that ability to effectively communicate in multiple modalities, of all the things that I learned as a magician, the most important has been understanding just how small an area of the brain Broca's area is. That's where all of our language processing parts are. And it's only on one hemisphere of our head. And when you understand that not everything can be put into words, and that that's the thinnest part of the pipeline, that we communicate with our micro expressions, with our body posture, with our lyrical pacing, with our attention and listening, our active listening, then you understand that much like I thought the throat clearing words about what I was about to do was an effective way to presage my performance on the street, it turns out I was doing the performance the entire time. Later, I realized that I could go on someone else's stage and behave as though I was just a tech setting up a bunch of little doodads on stage while the audience was talking. And eventually, I would pick up one doodad and I would light it, and then a little bit of fire would happen. And I'd check out the fire and put it out with my hand. And I was aware, even though I was pretending not to be, that the front row had started to kind of track what I was up to. And so without doing a performance, I did another arrangement and I took a spin and torch in an interesting way. And then finally I would look up, my chest would expand. I would adopt an authoritative posture. When I had about 1/3 of the audience's attention, I would make my first harvest. I would simply say, shh, and like a wave over the audience, it would get quiet. Now, at that point, we were square. At that point, it was mine to screw up. But instead of announcing who I was or what I was about to do, as if it was the most natural thing on the planet, I just gave a lecture on the history of fire eating, as though that's what everybody was there for. The concept of resistance to fire is one as old as history itself. As far back as the ancient Greek tragedy Medea, references are made to holding a bar of red-hot iron in one's hands as I wrap my fingers around the flame to prove innocence or sincerity. The first written account, and so on and so on. And by this moment, I denied them the opportunity to even applaud, because every time they're about to get square, I'm like, not yet, suckers. You got more. First, you're going to see me eat fire. Then you're going to see me blow it. And then when I get to like my third trick, I'm referencing some dude in the 1800s. I'm leaning back. The fire's about to go in my mouth where I'm going to clench it in my teeth. And I say, oh, at which point his audiences would burst into applause. That's the first off ramp I've given them. And by God, are they excited to get square. And now we're in the rhythm, we're in the flow. And just like that, that's what it took for me to learn what my bunny on the table was, a way to give a performance before the performance even begins.
What you've created is an unofficial start. It started, you've done a lot of prep. You know that there's a procedure happening in that moment, but the audience, whoever you're working with, doesn't necessarily know that to be the case. And there is an extra element of excitement when people start to be aware of that. I'm sure there's murmurs in the audience as they're like, is anyone else seeing this? Because you're acting in a way that is kind of hidden, but yet you're there. And I really love that. I wonder if we can, because this, I think, ties into something you referenced in one of your office hour videos, is this activity that you did, you claim as the most unfair storytelling activity, called Don't Get Brodied.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think this ties into this, like, in the, what you were doing on stage there was avoiding the getting brodied, and now you've formulated it into a activity that people can do to help them with storytelling. I wonder if you could describe that.
Yeah. So on our comedy podcast, Great Night, you can see it at greatnight.tv. Justin Robert Young and I, the problem that we had on our show is we wanted to do a call-in thing, but people didn't know how to do a call-in thing. They would do a lot of throat clearing and it was not entertaining. So we said, look, here are the rules. We're going to put our thumbs up like we're watching gladiators. And the moment one of our thumbs goes down, we're going to play the song Brody Quest, and then we're going to send you packing. And so in the stage show version, you get 4 people already, and you measure success not by the quality of your story. No, we're not doing the applausometer at the end because it's questionable whether or not you'll even make it to the end. All that matters is the number of seconds you're able to go, because the game is called Don't Not Tell a Good Story. It's called Don't Get Brodied. And so the moment somebody begins, they naturally figure out that the key is call your shot. Like Babe Ruth holding a bat in one hand, the other hand pointing to the stands. Let us know where we're gonna go. Be like Sam Horn. Tell me exactly how long I'm on the hook for, and let me decide if I'm willing to spike it at this point. Second of all, make yourself relatable. If you look at the hero's journey, the monomyth, all that Joseph Campbell stuff, the hero with 1,000 faces, the one thing that we love is a low status protagonist. And if you are the protagonist of this story, you better immediately tell me, this is the story of how I jumped off a deck and onto the rotting corpse of a manatee. What? You have my attention. You just bought 15 full seconds that are yours to screw up, good sir. This is the story of how I found monkey poo inside my chocolate syrup or whatever. It doesn't matter. The point is, give us somebody non-threatening and relatable so we allow ourselves to project ourselves into there, and you will buy time. And this, of course, what I'm describing with Don't Get Brodied is quite literally that story attention sales cycle in action. We begin with a gift of immediately saying, whether it's indicating that you're respecting their time, whether it's indicating getting a laugh out of a surprising beat or whatever, you earn that attention and then you harvest it to go just a little bit farther. And if you're telling a good story, the story's going to get bigger and bigger and your relationship is going to get deeper and deeper.
I think that is the drawing in is something that I think that educators need to do more of in the way that I've seen them sometimes. It's content focused. This is what I'm going to tell you, but what's the draw in? And I love the framing of, like, I'm going to give you almost the end. We call it in, I wish I could draw on my screen, but I'm going to just do it with my fingers. But we talk about framing of an activity. And the concept of a frame is that it goes all the way around. So if I'm going to frame some learning, I'm going to say, where are we going? I'm going to start to initiate that at the start, so that by the time we've had the core part in the middle, I can go all the way around and go all the way back to the start and say, if you remember at the start, I'd referenced that our aim was to get to this point. And then there's a lot of this, oh, wow, we've made it on this journey that we've gone all the way around.
I mentioned that you see the same structure multiple times. And in that case, that framing device in the world of YouTube, when it comes to shorts, I'm fascinated by these 1-minute pixels. That there's a hard limit. I think you can go up to 3 minutes, but I don't recommend it. I say keep to 1 minute. And a good short, if a standard story is a 3 act structure, if it's quite simply and, but, therefore, then you have to begin with but. Start, if there's a door that gets kicked in, start with the door getting kicked in. And then I don't know what that was, but something's happening. Then the number one short that we have on the Modern Rogue is me and Deviant Olive, and the door kicks in. And suddenly, Deviant is explaining to me, oh, we have this gizmo. It's supposed to keep doors locked and keep people safe. And it's supposed to work like this and. But a bad guy could grab this, twist this, and do this around. And if he does, his boot gets ready to kick in the door. Technically, that's when the short ends. But instead, what are you going to do? Skip now? No, you're going to watch that beginning again as boom, therefore, the door kicks open. Good storytelling has those loops that go again and again. And each time you encounter a piece of the story, you are the one who was changed along that journey. And as a result, that door getting kicked in looks different. That explosion is different now that you know everything that went into it.
I think sometimes the best magic performances, the best comedians, stand-up comedians do this really well. Something I reference often to educators is the idea of callbacks, which is that same concept of going all the way around. If someone had in a stand-up comedy show had referenced a story or a joke, and that also ends up right at the start, and that ends up to being the final punchline at the end, the applause is so much greater than if they'd have just done the punchline, because people remember that first piece. In the same way, when a magician has an envelope on a desk at the front and goes, you remember that thing I had at the front, and then calls that back, how much more powerful that can feel than if they're at the front. Reference as well, and this is maybe the last thing I'll mention here, is you'd reference the introverted participants in your workshop started to be more willing to participate once they understood the parameters of what they were participating in. And I kind of think that for people who are like, well, I'm not really good at telling stories, I don't think charisma is the end result to what makes a good educator. Or I think it can be something that gets taught. And I think that that's what you're suggesting in some of the structures and frames, right?
Yeah, well, and I think this is an important distinction. Teller wrote me an extraordinary letter when I was a youngster, where it's like 4.5 page long essay. If you just search Brian Brushwood Teller letter, you'll find it. But he gave what essentially ended up being the blueprint for my entire career. He reminded me, withhold basic plot points, allow people to convince themselves that 2 and 2 equal 5, then reveal the truth 4 and blow them away. But don't insult their intelligence. Let them feel seen. Let them walk piece by piece through it. If it is important, and this is my spin on Teller's sentiment, if it is important, you must never say it out loud. That's why I never said out loud that Scam School was beginner lessons in magic. I will never admit out loud that Modern Rogue is low budget Mythbusters teaching science in an obscured, ridiculous kind of way, right? So instead, you've got your secret thing if after you give your presentation, somebody walks up and they think they're the clever ones who say, you know what? You pretend to be about scams and cons, but you're really teaching critical thinking. At which point, me, the video game designer, the guy who carefully crafted the entire tableau and is finally seeing them figure out all on their own the entire purpose of the experiment, I clap my hands. I'm like, you're so smart. You're the best. You are the hero of the hero's journey.
That feels like a beautiful end to this conversation. And we've almost gone through a little bit of a journey together as we've started at your origin point to Scam School, your evolution through that process, your awareness of storytelling being the magic elixir. And then now we're talking about these concepts that are so evident and important. And once again, I just want to say, as someone who's followed you for almost 20 years, and from an educational perspective, I've been able to draw those educational moments. I've certainly had aha moments myself from what you've taught. One thing I often encourage people to do is find something you're interested and passionate in that doesn't have to be exactly aligned. That's I think the beginning with a gift, right? It's the bringing in something. And I think that what we do as educators is bring in some of the things we're excited about and draw them into our educational plan. And that's the gift. And for me, card tricks was what started me. And I want to thank you, Brian, for what you've done to help support that journey through my education.
The way Teller put it is, have heroes outside of magic. Mine are Hitchcock, Poe, Sophocles, Shakespeare, and Bach. You're welcome to borrow them, but you must learn to love them for yourself, for your own reasons. Then they'll push you in the right direction.
That's even more perfect. That's a better way of saying the ramble that I was saying. Well, thank you, Brian, for joining me. And thank you for everything you're doing and supporting people in storytelling and now protection services and AI. And I see a lot of cool stuff that you're doing out in the world.
I'll say this much.
Yeah,
If you want to hear some pretty good storytelling, World's Greatest Con is the best thing I've ever been a part of. If I'm remembered for one thing, I hope it's that program. So if you go to World's Greatest Con, you could do that. Or just tell me about yourself. Write about yourself and send it to me, brian@schwood.com. There is no C in Schwood, SHWOOD.
awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. It's been a
You
real
got it.
pleasure.